Hey everybody, how's everybody doing? I'm going to share my screen here. We're bouncing things around here and trying to make sure I have all the right windows in the right places. So today we want to talk, as everybody kind of is trickling in here, about how outdated technology can slow down your business. I think sometimes as we talk about these things, people think that we're just trying to sell them stuff. Everybody needs a new computer or whatever. That's certainly not the case. And we just want to kind of talk through the ups and downs and what it means to your business to have older, slower technology and why it's important to look at it. By way of intros, my name is Mike Bazar. I'm the CTO and one of the partners here at Vector Choice Technologies. That's a whole lot of stuff up there that basically says I'm a lifelong nerd. So I went to the Colorado School of Mines, got a degree in mechanical engineering, and then decided I wanted to tinker with computers and kind of started doing IT around, I don't know, I guess 2003, and then really made it into what I wanted to do in a company. And about 2009, grew that, worked for a couple other companies before I'd started this. And then just this year, Will and I merged our companies together. And so we merged my company, Bizarre Solutions, with Vector Choice. So now we're 50-50 partners in this new Vector Choice, and moving forward, just looking to keep growing and helping as many small businesses and along the way as we go. So one of the things, fun fact about me, is I would love to go touch every ocean and be on every continent. And so far, I'm missing Antarctica and Australia. Almost got the Arctic Ocean a couple of weeks ago, but missed it by about 50 miles. Didn't make it all the way to the Arctic Ocean, but we'll remedy that soon. So I've also got on the call with me John DePero, who John will probably do a bad job introing you, but he's the wizard and the ninja of all things compliance. So he's our chief compliance officer. He absolutely knows like CMMC and other compliance. He's a member of the American Bar Association. He was in counterintelligence in the Army. He has retired, but knows all kinds of things. And occasionally we'll be having conversations and I'll say something I think is, what about this? And he'll be like, I know how to do that from the background. And it's always interesting to know what Special Agent DePero retired. Yes, retired.
You can make the case I'm not doing retired very well, but I am retired.
Yeah. So anyway, so John is an expert at looking through, like contracts and other things, and really looking at what do we need to do on a compliance perspective. And I have to say, it's a very special role in terms of there's a lot of people out there who can look at an agreement, and he can really help kind of boil it down to, as he likes to say, informed risk decisions, right? Not that you have to do and spend and always go and figure out, but you need to know what the risk is, what the impact to your business is, what it's going to mean down the road in terms of compliance, maybe with your insurance policies, compliance with FTC safeguards, compliance with CMMC if you're in defense industry, PCI, HIPAA. There's all these different things. And a lot of the time businesses just don't know that they don't need to be compliant or that they aren't compliant. So John certainly helps us sort through that with customers as we go through that. And then Bo Dickey is on as well. Bo is our chief security officer. So he's got over 20 years in security operations, law enforcement. And so Bo fits into the same thing where I'll say something and then he's comes back and says, you got to think of it from these 7 things from a security perspective or the back end, or, kind of the criminal mindset maybe of this is what they might be doing. So this is why you don't want to do that, or we need to do this. And so Bo is, over our SOC and helps make sure that we do everything the way we should and filter everything through that security lens, which becomes a big deal. And again, the reason why, as we go through this, you might be thinking, why do we have the security and the compliance guy if we're talking about technology and how old computers can impact that? And really we're going to talk about that and more as we kind of go through those, so you can connect the dots and understand that a lot of the time, when we say, hey, let's upgrade or replace this computer, this server, this software, it's not just because we want to sell you something. It's because we want to help you stay compliant, secure, prepared for the future, those kinds of things. So a little bit of quick about us, and I kind of breezed through this, but I just think it's important to kind of who we are, so you know that we're talking from a point of totally blanking on words here, but a point of authority in the subject and what it is. But so Vector Choice been around for a bunch of years. Like I said, we've recently merged on the executive team. We've got Will, who's the CEO, who's not on the slide for some reason. And then we've got myself as the CTO, Sarah is our COO, John, as I'd said earlier, is our compliance officer, and Bo is security officer. And then we've got the rest of our management team. Jake is over business strategy. Troy is our VP of marketing. John is VP of technical operations. Gabby's over finance, and Emma and Sarah in marketing as well. But the point is we're building, growing, constantly evolving this thing. I think we have a really good set of expertise that we've put together that we try to then use to bring to all of our customers, which is reflected in some of the awards and other things that we've won, right? So we've been on the MSP 501 list, the Inc. 5000 list, Atlanta's Best and Brightest, some Inc. regional lists. So again, it's not necessarily toot our horn as much as we know what we're talking about. We've been growing and doing great things in what we're doing, I think, and authority in the space. We have locations all over the place. I basically use this to highlight Mississippi and say, if anybody needs help in Mississippi, we got to cover that white square up as we keep kind of moving for USA dominance here. But we've got several offices spread across. We've served clients in over 23 states, plus worked internationally with people. So again, I think we've got a pretty good authority when we come into it. A little bit of what we do, cybersecurity services, managed IT, consulting. We do security and risk assessments. We have cloud consulting services, kind of day-to-day support services. Really, a lot of compliance, and it boils down to that last bubble there is as a service. There's a lot of things we can do either as a project or as a service. And these days, as a service becomes more and more important because with compliance, with security, with IT, it's an ongoing thing. It isn't just hey, I bought a new computer and the process is done. There's a whole lot that continues to go on. And so that's a lot of what we do and focus is how do we help keep pushing people forward in this, cloud connected as a service kind of world and everything else. Our process, if you want to work with us, we basically do a lot of meetings, initial meeting to uncover your needs. We'll do a network assessment to really decide what that need is. Part of the reason I put this up here even is if you're shopping for an IT provider, aren't sure about your IT provider or talking about it, if they don't have a good solid process, that can be a problem. So we'll really do those network assessments to figure out what that is. Then we'll look at, what is it going to take to do that initial work, do our onboarding, implementation, install, and then we kind of go back through a lot of this again, right? We'll go back and uncover more needs and redo network assessments and do this constant process improvement as we continue to go for things. As a, just a shout out here a little bit, Will recently has this, the compliance formula. You can scan that QR code and get it on Amazon. But if you've thought about how to do compliance and other things, want some background and a little bit of insight, that's a great book to go kind of get you down that road. I think the moral of the story is if you read it, you'll probably go, this is a whole lot of things. I need help. And that's what we're here to do, is to help you through that process. So getting into the meat and potatoes of this and why everybody actually signed up for the webinar was less to hear about us and more to hear about how technology and your business all impact each other. And like I said earlier, a lot of the time people think it's just, well, you're selling computers, or yeah, we can't get it too old. Well, let's wait till it's really slow. They've done some different studies and they update this all the time. But the last big one I saw is Intel did a study that said if you replace your computer every 3 to 4 years, but in that kind of 3-ish mark, the performance gains that you get out of that will increase productivity enough that you'll usually pay for the computer cost in the next year of productivity gains. So if you look at something, you say, hey, how do I make my people more productive? How do we continue to push and do more? If they're waiting on applications to open and as they get more and more complex, they get slower and slower on those PCs. That's the kind of stuff we're looking at. So old technology often is slow and outdated, and it makes it, hard for people to do their job. You'll have happier employees if they have better and faster computers, right? We deal with that a lot, and we see that as we go in and replace computers for people that were maybe 5, 6, 8, we've seen, 10 and 13-year-old PCs that people love getting a new computer. It makes it a lot faster. It can actually improve morale in the company if you have a good plan to constantly kind of replace computers and keep them up to date. The other thing we see a lot of, again, the second bullet, is lost productivity, frustrated people. That's the big thing, replacing them. And then, newer software and hardware, you can run into compatibility issues, especially when you start talking about Windows 10 and Windows 11 and how does software work with those. You don't want people to lose productivity because their computers are slow. Like that is a problem. And as we look at remote work, as we look more at people working in different areas, this becomes a big deal. And Bo, you've probably seen some of this as well, is a lot of the time we'll take over a customer, we'll roll out our new security software, and the computers come crawling to a halt because they can't handle that new software. And so, Bo, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's one of those things that as this stuff and goes on. And this is the next slide. We'll talk about security risks, but you get that new software and it's doing more stuff than the old security software used to do.
Yeah, you run into issues where there's not enough RAM because the system can't be upgraded more, or the processors being bogged down because it's an older processor that doesn't match the new architecture. I mean, at the end of the day, if a system isn't running as optimally as it should, when you add a larger workload to it that's running in the background, you don't see what's causing the issues. And sometimes it's because the hardware is old. The other aspect of it is that older hardware, you can't get the security tools on there. In some cases, it's old software that doesn't support the new requirements for some of the back end dependencies of software. But all of those things are essentially a security risk, because if you don't have the tools that are actively monitoring and providing the protection and security standards, then that system is now a vulnerability. It's a place for an attacker to go and hide without worry of being detected, to do whatever kind of damage they want to do, whether that's stealing your information, ransoming your systems, or impersonating your employees to force you to channel money out through ACH transfers.
Yeah. And one of the things I've seen in a couple of places is a lot of people go, well, all my data is in the cloud. I don't need to worry about my local PCs or security or those kinds of things. And what I always say is that risk is still yours, because if I can get on your PC as a hacker, I can do keystroke logging. I can capture data as you enter it or pull it out of your system if I can get access as you. So just because your stuff is in the cloud and you feel like I can use older, slower computers because everything's in the cloud, there can be a real problem with that. And one of the ones that we see with that, specifically to hardware, is Windows 11 requires there's a chipset now. It's called TPM, Trusted Platform Module. Has to do with disk encryption and a bunch of these other kind of back end things that Windows does. That TPM chip has to be of a certain newness, a certain, recent age, or Windows 11 won't run. Like, it just can't. And that's what we see a lot of. Is it's not that a processor or the RAM can't handle Windows 11. It's that the TPM chips and those things are old. And then you start running into compliance issues because you can't encrypt data because you don't have the right TPM chip, and HIPAA or PCI or whatever these other things are. John, you probably got something there to chip in around,
I bring it way down from Bo and Mike level. No one cares what a TPM chip is. Your insurance carrier said you got to encrypt your data. You just can't do it, right?
Yeah.
You just can't. It's not possible. Don't worry about chips and TPM and file vault versus versus BitLocker. Like, who cares, right?
Yeah.
You made a business decision to manage risk. And one of the strategies for mitigating risk, financial risk, was insurance. Well, if the insurance is never going to get paid, why have the policy at all? That's how I come at it, right?
Yeah.
So everything Mike and Bo said is 100% true. I'm not discounting the technical validity of your statements, but the business function as a small business owner, what is the business function you're trying to achieve? Well, if my secretary dumps coffee in the file server, if a Russian hacker ransom, whatever happens, insurance was a tool you selected. We're just telling you, you're not going to get paid because you said you'd have encryption, and it's not possible. And what I ask people to do is map these business functions to the technology. It's either going to support it or it's going to prohibit it, right? This is an example when technology is prohibiting you from achieving a business function.
Yeah.
So let's have that discussion. Where are you trying to be 6 months from now, 2 years from now, right? And don't get caught with what I call operational surprise.
Yeah.
Bo and I were on with a client. I'll make this real quick. Just this week, they're trying to pursue a government contract. That government contract, the qualifying packet says, are you using any end of life software or hardware? Well, they have a workload that's in a database that is multiple years out of date. But it works, right? Going to that business owner, it still does what they needed to do. So they've never replaced it. But now they're sitting on multi-million-dollar contract that they've been deemed not technically qualified to bid for, because that database that actually doesn't have anything to do with the contract, but forces them to say on paper, yes, we use end-of-life software and servers.
Yeah. No, and I think that's the thing. A lot of other side of this too is, we tend to talk about, people think software or hardware, but even this can be networking stuff, right? The increased risk of data breaches.
Right.
If you have really old switches, They may not support virtual networking, where we could do, they're called VLANs, but again, basically you're virtually separating traffic. One of the biggest heists that has ever happened in Vegas was because a hacker got into their network through the thermostat control for a fish tank in the lobby. And so what we look at when we go in a lot of these things is we want to take old switches and get rid of them, not because I'm trying to sell you stuff, but because we want to isolate the IoT devices, your thermostat, your cameras, your NVR. We don't want those to touch the data on the network, the rest of it. So now we can separate those things, right? Same sort of stuff will happen with wireless. You know, if you still use old types of encryption, that's really easy to hack now. And so you need something with Wi-Fi 6 and WPA3 and all these technical terms you don't really care about, but it's so that you can be more secure and keep your data secure. And it's getting to the point with a lot of this that it really is almost a selling point to customers, right? There's a little bit of where people are numb to losing their data, and there's also some of it where they're just friggin' tired of it. And so it is becoming more and more that you have to do it. We're seeing different things like the FTC safeguards that came down just, this year that impacts a lot of, auto dealerships and legal firms, and depends on how you deal with, taxes and other things in terms of CPAs. There's, 12 categories or 15 categories, I forget, of businesses. But the point being, there's this larger group now that normally didn't have any compliance standards other than PCI if they accepted credit cards or something like that now have to have these sets of safeguards. And some of that is data encryption and other things. And if you have really old technology, you can't do it. And that becomes a real problem. And we're seeing a lot of privacy laws come down as well. Like I know in Texas, it's the one I always cite because it's just easy and I'm in Texas. But if 250 Texans, so it doesn't matter where your business is, 250 Texans are in your database and they have their data stolen, you're supposed to report that to the Attorney General's office to the state of Texas. Well, what comes out of that? That could be an investigation. There could be other things. They could find you negligent in the way you're handling data. There's a lot of this stuff that comes out of it. And what we want to try to do is make sure you have the right technology to have the right standards in place that you can not worry about these things. And that's where a lot of people get hung up in this, is they keep the old stuff, and it still works back to, that database, right? It works. It does what it's supposed to. But at a certain point, it becomes a risk to your business, and that becomes the real problem that you want to make sure you're addressing in a reasonable and timely fashion.
Yeah, I'm a car guy. You know me. Like anyone who's met me in person, like I'll start talking about cars within the first minute. So this owner, Mike, as a business owner, you bought company vehicles, right? You have a regular maintenance schedule. You know about how long, based on depreciation and functionality, you had a goal for how long that car that you bought for the business would last. And then that car has tires. And we know those tires, they're supposed to last 50,000 miles. And we're probably not going to wait till we blow it out, probably at 45,000, right? But we do that in business with stuff all the time.
Yeah.
The problem with IT is we buy a tire that has a 50,000 mile rating, and then 6 months later, our state regulators come back and say no tire can be used for over 20,000 miles. And they're like, well, I already bought the 50,000 mile tire. IT is such a moving target right now with security, with compliance, with all these standards. That's why it's so critical to at least have a map. If you've never defined how long you expect an IT resource to last, how do you know if you've hit it or not?
Yeah.
Right. Part is just having a good partner, having a good account manager, someone to sit down with you and map out when do we expect to start looking at replacing stuff, and then have someone watching changes in your business to alert you to changes, like the Texas law, right? Hey, bad news, Mike. We cannot with our current technology support this change. I see it all with insurance. Everything's good. We get your insurance good. You meet all the terms and conditions. 11 months go by, you get a new insurance questionnaire, and there's 5 or 6 things that you're no longer can click yes to.
Yeah. And that's one thing I would say, and I know that this is almost a compliance thing, but it falls into this, is if you have cyber insurance and you haven't looked at that policy recently, you should call your insurance agent when you're done with this call and see what the requirements are, because that has changed a lot in the last 6 to 12 months, because they all lost their shirts to cyber policies. They absolutely got creamed because people had bad security in place, and they got just creamed because people were using old technology, old cyber products. They weren't looking at the new stuff and adopting new methodologies around that. And that became a real problem, and they just lost their shirts on
it. And that, so 2 years ago, they lost their shirt. So last year they raised rates, and they made these questionnaires go from 5 questions to 5 pages of questions, right?
Yep.
I was reading a great article just 2 weeks ago out of England, but that cybersecurity payments have dropped for the first month ever.
Yeah.
Payments by, and the reason for that is not because there's less attacks. It's because those 5-page documents are being used to not pay premium, not pay claims,
Yeah.
right? They don't have to pay you because you said they asked an all question and you said, well, we mostly do it. So you clicked yes. Well, and then you had a claim and they came back and said, no, the question was all, not 99%, not 90%, 100%. And so we're just not going to pay the claim.
Yeah. And to kind of keep on the technology side of this, like that's one of the reasons we use a product that tracks governance and everything else is we're doing compliance pieces for people. And that falls into like 2 years ago, nobody was cared about the compliance standards per se. They didn't care. Well, John has always cared about them, but they didn't
I
care
still
about
don't
that.
care.
They weren't tracking it. They weren't like, it wasn't things that IT providers were talking about. Now we are, because of all these things that are coming up where we have to start tracking it to prove that you're doing what you're doing. So again, it falls into this outdated technology. You have to track these things and look at them. We've got some other stuff we'll hit up here in a little bit, but to keep moving forward, just a couple specific examples because everybody likes that. So in 2017, Equifax had a data breach. Over 143 million people had their data exposed, and it came because there was outdated software that wasn't patched and there was a known vulnerability. Same thing happened in 2019 when there was a Marriott chain breach, and then the Colonial Pipeline, they had a ransomware attack, and it was the same. They were using outdated software. It wasn't patched. There was an old user that wasn't patched. They weren't using newer technology around SOC and monitoring these logins and other things that would look for these systems to say, hey, this person hasn't logged in for 6 months, and all of a sudden they just logged into the system. That might be a problem, right? And all these other technologies that are coming out around the security side, that's why we adopt a lot of those and keep pushing forward, because all these hacks, as they happen, almost all of them are happening because there's known vulnerabilities. There was the big one that happened that isn't even on here. There was a few years back where I forget which worm it was, but the WannaCry, and it went across all of Europe and it shut down like the health and the hospital systems in the UK and everything else. And it all attacked a known Microsoft vulnerability that wasn't patched on a whole bunch of computers. And so they had outdated technology, outdated patching, and that brought an entire country's hospital system to its knees because they didn't do the right patching, because they didn't keep the technology up to date. And so that's where all these things really start to come together. And you realize that not only do you need the right hardware, you need the right software, you need the right updates, you need all these pieces to be up to date, or you end up losing out. And oftentimes, back to the first slide, we just think of it as lost productivity, or it's slow, or maybe it crashes once or extra. But all of this stuff is starting to come together in a big spider web of you just can't have outdated technology anymore, right? So a few things on how to mitigate security risks of using it, right? You have to keep track of your software and your hardware vendors and know what their security bulletins are. So you can either go sign up. A lot of them have support, type emails they'll send out with security bulletins and other things. You need to apply security patches when they're released, which is great, but in itself sometimes can cause issues. Like Print Nightmare, when it happened, Microsoft released a patch to solve a printer security problem, and it caused more printer problems in the way they did that. So then they released another patch to update it and other things. Make sure you're using a firewall, and this is the one we see a lot of the time where people have a firewall, but they haven't updated it in a long time. We had a customer who had a firewall. We kept telling them to update it. It was a co-managed thing. So we kept telling their in-house people, update your firewall. There's a known vulnerability. There's a known vulnerability. There's a known vulnerability. Do you want us to do it? And they kept saying, no, we'll do it. And then our security software alerted that somebody across the internet was trying to mount shares on their server and steal all their data. And they had to go pull their internet connection and shut everything down. And it was all through this known vulnerability. And so if they'd updated it, it never would have happened. We caught it. No damage happened, which is good. But why have the fire drill? For an hour and a half, 2 hours, their whole system was down. They couldn't sell, they couldn't transact, they couldn't do what they needed to do because they had to just go pull the internet, then go back and update the firmware, make sure everything was right, make sure there wasn't a security problem. All this happened because they didn't update the technology the way they were supposed to. Make sure you're using strong passwords, but on top of that, multi-factor is a big thing. And that's, again, newer types of technology. Multi-factor has been around for a while, but it's being pushed more and more and more. People tend to be resistant because they feel like it's a pain in the butt. But that's one of those things that'll stop a huge amount of these hacks, is just having multi-factor. And that's where you get a code in your email, or ideally you're using a like Google Authenticator or Authy, Microsoft Authenticator, getting a text to your cell phone. But it's where you either have to put in an extra 6-digit code or click a link to verify in your email that you are who you say you are when you go to log in. Educate your employees about cybersecurity best practices. Again, we do a lot of cybersecurity training. There's some products out there you can do it with. But 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we weren't having these conversations. Just the other day, we had a customer that gave away their password to somebody, and then that guy logged into their email, and we found it and we fixed it before bad happened. But it was because they didn't have two-factor turned on, because they weren't doing education, right? All these things can happen because you aren't using the newest of this, security technologies and other things that are out there. And the thing I would say about that last bullet point of hire a trusted provider, an IT provider, is a lot of those other things are hard to do. They just are, right? And a lot of companies, either you can't hire a jack of all trades that can do everything well. They do parts of it well. And I'm not knocking any of this, but we see it a lot in companies that are maybe 50, 100, 200 users. They'll have one in-house IT person, and they're so busy doing all the day-to-day, they can't do these other things. And so we do a lot of kind of co-managed things where we can help with the security and the compliance, help augment. We can take it all over, whatever works for your business. The point being, to do all of these is hard and difficult. And if you don't have a good IT provider that's doing it, you're opening yourself to risk. And that's the other conversation you would have, is if your IT provider is not talking to you about these things, not having somebody come have different conversations with you, that can be a problem. And that in itself might be a reason that you want to look. And at a minimum, you should have the conversations with your IT provider. And if they don't give you answers that you like, might be an option to go start shopping and saying, hey, you're not talking to me about how you patch and how you keep everything up to date and how we're educating people and how we're doing MFA, all those things. And I want to know, because this is my business and my baby and the thing that I've built. And so don't let these things kind of age and get old and not do something about it. Make sure you're having these conversations as well.
Yeah, concrete, tangible example of that.
Yep.
So what Mike said earlier, Windows has announced, Microsoft announced Windows 10 hits end of life in 2025. There's a myriad of reasons. It's all security based, but there's reasons. That means end of life. No new patches, they don't care what happens to it. Yep. So if you're a business owner, you should know exactly how many Windows 10 machines you have, and you should have a date on a calendar that you've decided they will all be replaced by then. And replace doesn't mean I put in the order on Amazon hoping that it's shipping, right? That is replaced, up, running, users, files are transferred, like everything, right?
And the thing is that doesn't have to be painful a lot of the time. What usually happens is you don't think about it. Keeping technology up to date is not important. The end of life comes up, and now you've got 30 days to replace 40 computers, and that's painful. But if you start now, hey, let's replace a couple a month, go for the old ones, let's replace those.
Right.
And just escalate through, and we can work it in with budgets. We can work it in with need. We can work it in with all these different things. But if you wait until it's 90 days till end of life, and you have to be HIPAA compliant, PCI compliant, CMMC compliant, all those things that say, how do you patch? And now your answer is, I can't, because they don't release security updates. You instantly have this problem that can cause a lot of problems down the road. And so you need to stay ahead of that.
You don't have the problem. Every procrastinator in the world has that problem. How many companies are going to wait till the last minute to replace their Windows 11 devices?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question.
COVID supply chain all over again.
Yeah, it's good that you asked that question, because it's happening right now.
Yeah.
Server 2012 is end of life in October. Server 2008 went end of life last year. Server 2016 is next on the chopping block. It's all mostly because of security issues.
Yeah.
Some of it is feature sets. They've got new features that are available that aren't backwards compatible.
Yeah.
But those servers, you can do a quick scan of the internet and look and see, and there's still over 180,000 in the US alone of Windows Server 2012 online talking to the internet right now.
Yeah, which means there's more that are behind that we can't see, right?
Right. That's just the ones that we can see with a free open security scan of the open internet without breaking any laws.
Yeah. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about end of life, here in the next slide. But, one of the things, and we've kind of gone back and forth as we've weaved through this, because they're all very closely related. But the big thing on this slide is, steps to mitigate compliance risk, right? So one of the things is you have to know what it is, right? So you got to stay up to date on the latest regulations. What impacts your industry? PCI is getting major updates that are all rolling out. And if you accept credit cards, you need to know what that is. And a lot of what this does is it makes it so if you're, and John is always good with this, right? So if you accept credit cards And the odds of you getting sued or failed out of a PCI audit are usually lower than most people worry about, which is why people generally go, what's PCI compliance? I don't care. The problem becomes when somebody abuses your account, right? Your terminal and your credit card machine, whatever it is, they hack into your computer, they make all these fraudulent transactions, and you go back and say, I don't want to be responsible for those. As these new agreements come out, as these new compliance requirements come out, those credit card vendors are coming back and saying, you didn't comply with the agreement, you're liable for that. So where before normally you'd be able to say, hey, that $50,000 in fraud, that's their problem. It now becomes your problem, depending on what agreement you signed, what your contracts say, and what the regulations are talking about.
Yeah, Landry's restaurant chain, bunch of restaurants, probably 1,100 locations. Now, understand that's a big enterprise, and I hate giving huge examples to people because most of the people on this call are SMB, right? But legal precedence usually comes from big enterprise, right? So
Yep.
Landry Seafood had an issue. There were bazillion Visa, they got compromised. A bazillion Visa transactions were found to be fraudulent. Visa went around doing audits at restaurants. It wound up being $30 million for them to send the forensics teams to go do all the audits. Landry's was found to not have been in violation of anything. They weren't. They were generally within the terms and conditions. So Visa hands them a bill for $30 million and say, well, what was the cost of making sure you are compliant? And Landry says, well, wait, we didn't do anything wrong, right? They said, you're right. But the contract you signed said you'll bear, if there is a breach, you'll bear the cost of the investigation. And it went to court and Landry's lost. That was the deal you signed. And I will argue, Mike, I'm gonna put you on the spot. As the business owner, will you raise your hand and swear you've read every page of every contract you've ever signed with every vendor?
No, I mean, that's it. Like, we haven't looked at all of them. Like, I
Right.
generally look at it. We run some of them through legal.
Sure.
But
And yeah, and I'm obviously putting them on
I
the
know,
spot and calling them out.
yeah,
But
like that's it. There are parts in there, right? And that are need to go back and be reviewed or changed.
Right.
And that's one of the things I would say, like we do, especially with John, right? Like, so we go back and look at it. And so as those contracts come up, we're reviewing those better than we ever have before because we're adapting to the new technology, new regulation. And that is one of the things that we do with customers. Hey, part of onboarding, let's meet with your insurance agent.
Right.
Let's look at your PCI agreements. Let's look and see what these are. Because if we can find the gotchas, you can either buy insurance to mitigate it. You can accept the risk. You could throw cash in the bank somewhere.
Right.
Or you can tell that credit card company, I don't want this agreement anymore. And we're going to go find a different agreement from a different provider that has more favorable terms.
Back to, and you can tell like I'm thinking of Mike because he's got my favorite phrase is informed risk decisions. That's the goal. No one's saying don't take credit cards. All I'm saying is there's a reason why one costs 3.5 points per charge and one costs 5 points, right? Whatever industry you're in, you can tell your prospects why you cost more or less than other vendor. Like, you know, that's their Kia doesn't cost what a Lamborghini costs, and it's okay, right? It's that with the IT stuff, most of our clients that I see, Mike, that we support, they truly don't understand the IT ramifications of why one credit card vendor is 3.5 points and another one's 5 points, or why one insurance policy is $8,000 a year and the other one's $6,000 a year, right? Because they just say, well, they're both $1 million in coverage, so I'll go with the cheaper one. Let us take a look at why that those sneaky hidden terms that you're agreeing to.
Yeah, no, for sure. So anyways, running down the list of this, right? You've got to make sure you know the regulations. You got to review your technology to make sure it's up to date and compliant. Like we'll talk in a minute. We've already kind of talked end of life, end of support. Those kinds of things become really, they matter. Have a plan in place to respond to the data breach or security incidents. That's a big piece of that. And then educate your employees about best practices. Again, number 4 is probably one of the easier ones to do, and a lot of people don't do it. It's just a matter of having a service that sends out education, make sure people are trained, tests them on that, looks for the weak spots, and then you find out that Susie in accounting clicks on every single phishing email. Well, let's go educate Susie, and let's go find ways that we can maybe mitigate risk around Susie. Have we limited her access to things? Can we monitor it? Can we turn on a different service? There's things we can do to help mitigate those risks. But if we don't know where they live because we haven't adopted the newer technologies, then you just kind of are walking around with your pants off. So getting into, and we've already kind of talked about this, end of life and end of support, right? A lot of people don't think about this and they just think I have a switch, I'll run it till it dies. I have a PC, I'll run it till it dies. I have a server, let's run it till it dies. Then I get it, because we want to, as business owners, get everything we can out of the investment that we've made. And that isn't a bad thing until it hits an issue and you can't do the security that you want, you can't do the compliance that you want. It becomes an actual performance problem. We've seen a lot where we'll take people that have databases, server's good, everything is good, it's running on old traditional spinny hard drives. And if it's a big database and we can move that to solid state hard drives, it's 10 times faster than it was. That is a huge increase in performance, which means every query every person in your company makes off that database is quicker and faster. That means they're more productive. That's a benefit, but that's because we put in new technology. And so a lot of the time we might look at it and go, hey, your server's good, this is going to be supported for another few years, but why don't we replace these hard drives? Why don't we upgrade this piece of it? Why don't we add a component? When you put this server in, you put in X amount of RAM, which is short-term memory, and the stuff you're using could take advantage of more. Let's upgrade it because we can do these things. So again, kind of bringing this back, sometimes the technology just needs the upgrade for the speed, for the process, not because of security and compliance, for other things. But a lot of the time when you get to end of life and end of support, what that really means is nobody's going to support it anymore. So when a hacker finds a way in, nobody's patching it. Nobody's going to go back and make sure that they can't. Nobody's shutting the door on that vulnerability. And if we don't shut the door on the vulnerability, you're just constantly exposing yourself to more and more risk. And then from a compliance perspective, from some of these other things, like again, back to the government contract, if part of that says, how do you patch? How do you do this? Make sure that you have capable security, and you can't, you can move yourself out of compliance and now you can lose contracts. You could lose potential to do business, right? Your credit card company may come back and go, hey, we're going to charge you X thousands of dollars a month because you're out of compliance and you can't update that software or that hardware like you're supposed to. And so there's a lot of these things where it really starts to matter, and you need to make sure you pay attention and know what is end of life, what is end of support. Again, hopefully you've got a good trusted IT provider that's doing that for you, having those conversations, that we're going out and looking at it. Because that's what Bo and his team, they spend a lot of time doing, is tracking that through our systems and making sure that we know what's end of life, that we communicate with our account managers who are communicating with our customers. And so they're coming back and saying, hey, did you know Windows 10 is going to be end of life in 2025? And we want to have a conversation about how we need to do it. Because again, if you've got 3 computers, you could probably buy those tomorrow and it's not going to kill you. But you've got 30 or 300, we need to really start planning this, because if you have a lot and you're in that bigger range, I mean, if you've got, let's say 500 days, I don't know what the days are until it is, and you've got 300 computers, that's replacing a computer every couple of days to make sure that you're up there. That's a lot of work if everything's Windows 10. So that's where we want to make sure we're really looking at these things, building plans and not letting stuff get to end of life and end of support, because it's just an unnecessary risk that you don't need to take as a business. And so one of the ways you can do that, right, end of life, they support technology issues, right? If you're waiting that long, it's probably just slow. I mean, if you're waiting to replace servers until they're end of life or end of support, they're gonna be slow. You're gonna lose a lot of productivity. Again, back to that stat of, Intel saying if you replace desktops every 3 years, that 4th year, it'll pay for itself and increase productivity gains. And we see that a lot where people have really old servers and we put in new and they're like, wow, this is fast, or we move it to the cloud or do something that, it looks at. And what that really adds up to is, and you hate to say this because I don't always want it to seem like it's a head count thing, but if you have 10 people and they're all 10% slower, you probably, if you kept your technology and things up to date, could run that same business with 9 people instead of 10 people. That becomes productivity gains. And maybe it's not that I want to get rid of the 10th person, but now I can grow and not hire 11, right? How do I continue to grow and be more profitable and do more things with what I have? And a lot of the time that comes back to having the right technology in place to make you more productive, to lower your security risks, to move you further along that productivity chain, because there's a big labor crunch that has happened and COVID masked some of it. But if you talk to a lot of economists and other stuff, they're basically saying with boomers retiring and big, other people coming into the workplace and as the economy is growing, we might face a labor shortage for the next several years. So having effective technology that makes you more productive becomes an actual need now, more so than people look at it, because we just need to try to do the same job with less people because we have to. There's going to be less people that are going to fill some of these job roles and other things as we go forward, or they're going to be changing jobs and other things as we go. So newer applications also become less and less compatible with older aging tech. And then overall your performance starts to drop, so it takes longer to do things. Here's a list of stuff, end of service dates. This is just for Microsoft, but we use this as an example, right? If you have Windows 7, 1/1/2023, it was out of support. So you're hooped. You have Windows 8.1, same. Server 28, same. Windows Defender, if you have old software, you start running down this list and you start looking at, oh, I'm using Office 2013. That's not supported anymore. So now they aren't going to fix problems with macros and other things that might cause security risks, because that's a real vector for people to attack. So that becomes a risk. You start looking at Excel 2019 and for Mac and some of these other things, and those are out real soon, right? PowerPoint, Office 2019, that's all going to be out real soon. So are you talking about how do I replace Office to the newest version so that I'm not out of compliance with that, right? So there's these things that you're going to start getting end of support dates and stuff creeping up. And if you're not paying attention, it becomes a real problem and a real expense. And so you want to go do that. So there's a website out there called endoflife.software. We use that. You can go look at it, look at your software and other things. But it's a searchable database of over 100,000 products that and pulls up news articles and other things, but also end of life and end of support. And so a lot of these things are, the big important things that we have is making sure that you're not end of life, productivity gains. How do you comply with security and compliance requirements for legal contracts, cyber insurance, some of these other things that a lot of the time when we say compliance, people think it's a regulated industry, but a lot of the time it's just being compliant with the contracts you signed with your vendors, compliant with the industries that you're in, like HIPAA and other things, compliant with the states that you operate and their privacy laws. Those
I'll tell you, Mike, what we stay busier with is, if you will allow the term, compliance requirements from people's customers saying, hey, we're doing vendor due diligence. And that used to just be financial, right? If I'm going to go with Mike's Ball Bearing Company as my preferred ball bearing vendor because I need them in my factory, it used to be very financial, right? If I sent you a big order, can you actually process it? Do you have enough cash reserves? Like, if I make you my guy, will you be there when I need you?
Yeah.
Well, that's 100-year-old process, and they've got that down. What they've realized now is the thing more likely to knock Mike's Ball Bearing out and therefore put my lawnmower factory out of commission, right, is cyber, right? How resilient is Mike and his ball bearing factory to a cyber attack? Do I have to get a bad phone call from Mike saying I can't ship you ball bearings for 2 weeks because my end of life server wasn't patched and now it's been ransomwared and it's going to take us like 2 weeks to be shipping again, right? And we're seeing that not just in manufacturing. Bo and I were on a call today that was clerical office support staff, right? That you would 6 months ago, you wouldn't have seen that, but here it is. It's more than just HIPAA. I get HIPAA, right? And the HIPAA police are not coming for you. It's that the world is going to ask you, are you doing the bare minimums? And can you prove it? Now, where do you look for your list of bare minimums? That we can help you navigate that. Could be your client, could be your state government.
Well,
could be, right.
And some of this, just to try to keep it to household technology, right? I mean, the point of the webinar is what we get back is as these conversations happen, old technology makes it harder to comply, makes your people less productive, makes it so you can't track things, makes it so you might not be able to comply or have the security that you need. And again, a lot of what we want to go back and talk about, and if you guys have questions, by all means, chuck them in the chat. But what we really wanted to make sure we're covering this isn't just because if we do a webinar that says old stuff makes you not productive, that's like 35 seconds. And people get it. But where they miss it a lot is the security, the compliance, these other pieces that come in. And so I don't want to feel like it's running off in one of the direction or the other. And you're thinking, I wanted to figure out how old technology matters to me. That's where it matters now, more and more and more. It's the risk that you create by having old technology becomes the problem over just Susie's computer is 8 years old and kind of slow, and we're going to replace it whenever we feel like it because Susie doesn't do a whole lot or whatever that case is, right? And now we want to start looking at how do we make your people more productive? How do we make sure we maximize labor efficiency? How do we make sure we maximize the people that you have? How do we make sure you're compliant and don't lose business and opportunity because you weren't compliant, because you had to stop and do these things, because you got hacked and it brought you down because you didn't want to update stuff, right? Something as simple as that TPM chip we were talking about before. The reason why that even matters is you lose a laptop, and it's encrypted and you can prove it, you have some level of safe harbor around that in terms of data breach. But if it isn't encrypted, or you think it is, but you can't prove it, it now becomes a reportable incident. And that's a whole different thing because somebody accidentally misplaced a laptop for 4 days. Well, your insurance or compliance might say you have to report that within 24 hours of knowing. Well, if they just misplaced it for a few days and they're pretty positive it didn't get stolen and you can do all the other stuff for safe harbor, you might have a window there where you can say, let's go find it before I have to go report it.
Yeah.
Because
How many times has an employee checked a laptop in a suitcase that didn't show up for 2 days or 3? Right.
Yeah, now, if you can't prove it was encrypted, that's a reportable incident. Then it shows up and you're like, well, crap, we just said we had a data breach, but you didn't really have a data breach. You just had to report it because you knew it was missing.
That's right.
Or it wasn't supposed to be, and you can't prove it was encrypted because you had old technology, right? That's where all this starts to come full circle of becoming a real problem, and you just don't want to have to go back and report it. So, and again, maybe you say, well, I don't have any of that regulation. 250 Texans data is on that, not to mention other states. You do have to report it, right? Because that's what the law says, and you have to go comply with that.
The 2 calls Bo and I had this week. I mean, this week, not like 6 months ago, we had it happen once, twice this week. We're on with clients who it's their customers saying, we can't do business with you if you don't do X. Now, they're under the gun. They're trying to sign a contract. They're being asked, do you do this? Yes, no. And the answer today is actually no, you don't do that, right? Yeah. So how do we get, now we're in this fire drill to give them a quick yes. If we would roll this back to those strategy meetings and say, are there any contracts you want to pursue in 24 that you currently don't do, like government contracts or state education, like education? Mike, if you do education, call Mike, talk to Mike and his team. There's stuff coming down the road for you. Be prepared for it. If you want to sell into education, there are compliance issues. So it's not just about IT. Well, I got to send email, so I guess I need IT. It's about what business goal do you have? If your goal is to sell to schools, IT can either prohibit you from doing it or enable you. And end of life, back to this thing, one of the biggest thing is unmanaged software and devices. And the biggest reason we can't manage software and devices is because they're old.
Yeah. Well, for sure. So kind of wrapping up here, I don't know if Bo, you have any closing thoughts or not, just because you've been quieter. But if you guys need anything, you can email us info@VectorChoice. There's a phone number. You can email myself, Bo, or John. Those are our emails. We watch them, we monitor them. We're happy to respond to people if you have questions, concerns, or thoughts. But the big point of all this, if you aren't sure, a lot of the time, the next good step is say, hey, can we do an audit? Can we have a conversation? Let's talk about this because I don't know where we're at and I don't want to get caught, unexpectedly having to upgrade a bunch of computers or do something or whatever the case is. So shoot us an email, ask for help. We're always happy to help with that. But Bo, you have any kind of closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would. My big thing is I would say that if you are already, excuse me, if you're unsure, it's cheaper to pay me to do an assessment than it is to pay me to do incident response. And I'm happy to do it if you just want to, even if you're not worried about whether or not you're doing some of the things, if you just want an idea of what a threat actor is looking for and how they're going to find a way in, give me a call, pick the number, shoot me an email. We can get something on the schedule because that's something else we can do for you as well.
Yeah,
to show you where the gaps are at.
I was saying we can do some fairly affordable kind of audits, even if you have an IT provider, just to keep them honest, right? We get audited by we have a third party audit us to make sure we're doing what we say we're doing, because we want to be able to check boxes and say we were doing them and that somebody else said we were doing them. It wasn't just us. And so a lot of the time we'll find that where somebody has a third party IT company and they just aren't sure. Well, we can do an audit. And if they're good, great. They're doing what they said they were doing. And if they aren't, that's a different conversation. But
or your in-house guy. You may have an in-house IT guy, and the client that Bo and I were talking to today, all their stuff was end of life. He's actually really smart. He's getting more done for his time and budget than any human on the planet. But he has a time. I mean, there's only so many hours in a day. Yeah. He only has a budget that he has. He has to put the fingers in the dam, right? He can't plug them all. He actually loved having us come in and show his boss, this is all the stuff one man's not able to keep up with. And he just got an assistant hired. So even if you are an IT guy at a company, let us make you look good. Let us help you get bigger budget, right? And show this is not something one person can do on their own.
Yeah, no, for sure. All right. Well, with that, I don't have any other slides on that. I think it was good. Again, if you guys have any questions or anything else, by all means, shoot over an email. Again, that was, the info@vectorchoice.com. Or give us a shout. You can just check out the website at vectorchoice.com. But we appreciate everybody hanging out with us today. And we'll see everybody next time, next go round.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody.
Shit it.